The new sanctions against Iran are designed not for peace, not to bring them to the table for a deal, but to provoke conflict. So let's go over what has happened so far, the updates with Iran. First of all, the Trump administration has added additional sanctions against Iran, this time sanctioning individual people. So these are called targeted sanctions. They're sort of like smart bombs, where they're meant to go after one particular person or a group of particular people rather than the entire country. And this time they've decided to sanction the leader of Iran, so the supreme leader, and as well as his office, anyone connected to his office, and several other leaders in the nation. And the Trump administration says that this would prevent them from being able to access financial assets that the U.S. says are worth billions. But here's the thing. I went on a mad egg hunt today trying to figure out exactly what these sanctions were, how they would affect the supreme leader. Like, I wanted to know specifics, like, wow, what would this look like? So if he calls up, is he not able to get money out of a bank? Is this personal or is this for the nation? Is this, does this mean that they wouldn't be able to sell assets? I wanted to know exactly what this meant, but I couldn't find anything. The Trump administration hasn't released any information about this. They're being very mum. They're just basically expecting us to take their word for it that this is definitely going to be something on them and it's worth billions. I don't think it's worth anything, and that's why they're remaining mum. If they're not going to give us any details, then it's really not much. There's probably not very many assets left that they could actually sanction against these particular people in Iran. And that is why this is actually not meant to bring them to the table, but this is instead to provoke them and squeeze them to the point where they push back. And when they push back, then we can say, oh, see, there they go. They did it. Now we have to go in for conflict. The supreme leader of Iran called the move outrageous and idiotic. He said that the Trump administration has become mentally crippled. And I think the first question we have to ask is, what is the goal here? And that's what I'm trying to figure out. And that's why I've come to this conclusion that I think this is actually to provoke the conflict. Trump said when he issued these sanctions, quote, "We will continue to increase pressure on Tehran until the regime abandons its dangerous activities and its aspirations, including the pursuit of nuclear weapons, increased enrichment of uranium, development of ballistic missiles, engagement in and support for terrorism, fueling of foreign conflicts, and belligerent acts directed against the U.S. and its allies." Okay, so they're saying, look, we don't want, they've got dangerous activities and its aspirations, including the pursuit of nuclear weapons. Then why the hell did we back out of the nuclear deal? If we didn't want them to pursue this, why did we back out of it? Because that's not what this is about, because this has nothing to do with that, really. And they mention all of these other things, the increased enrichment of uranium, which is the pursuit of nuclear weapons, they assume, development of ballistic missiles. So that's, again, nuclear weapons. So he's saying the same thing over and over again 3 times. You guys are pursuing a nuclear weapon. Engagement in and support for terrorism. So they're specifically talking about in Syria, the Hezbollah, they believe that the Iranians have been doing various acts or fueling terrorist groups against Israel. And Israel is going to be the key here, because I think that is really what this boils down to. So if we want them to not enrich their uranium, if we want them to back down from this, then we need to go back into the nuclear deal like all of the other nations, like China, Russia, and countries in the EU. We need to join them again and lift the sanctions on Iran. But instead, we backed out for really no real good reason. We then sanctioned them, which is, once again, what we're doing now, trying to put pressure on them so that they then push back. Because sanctioning a country is really like dropping a bomb on them. It's way more socially acceptable to sanction a country because we don't actually see the death toll of a sanction. But believe me, there is a death toll. In fact, they say that the sanctions on Iraq back in the early 2000s was responsible for the death of 500,000 children. And it's because when you sanction a country, then they go under economic pressure. That means people lose their jobs. They're not able to get access to medicines. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to clean water. And all of a sudden, the death toll rises. Now, it's not a bomb, so it's not immediate. So you can't do a body death count, which is a lot easier with a bomb. It's slow. It's like putting a frog in a boiling pot of water versus just shooting the frog. So these sanctions, when we got out of the Iran deal, we put sanctions on them in order to squeeze them to the point where they would potentially do something to provoke us. That way we can say, see, even though we were the ones doing the initial provoking. That didn't work. We've been sanctioning Iran, by the way, for the last 40 years. Nothing's really ever worked. They're clearly not interested in invading Israel. They're not interested in going to war with the United States. They would have done it in these last 40 years if they were interested in that, and they just simply haven't. So now, we're running this up even further. We've been sanctioning them more. We backed out of the deal. We're putting more sanctions on them, and now we're putting more sanctions. And now we've even potentially made up attacks. Now the Russians have come out saying that they have evidence that the drone actually did invade Iranian airspace before it was shot down, that the Iranians are correct on that. So that's where we're at with this. Meanwhile, Mike Pompeo goes on a little tour of Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates, and he's trying to gain support from them in this possible war against Iran. He says that he wants to build a coalition of 20 different nations who will support the U.S., and he's starting apparently with, obviously, Israel already has the support. They're already there, and United Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So clearly these sanctions, when you look at them, they, for one, can't even give us details as to what these sanctions are. So what kind of pressure are they really going to be? This just looks like it's a facade, a pressure. And then we say, oh, see, they're still not coming to the negotiation table. They're still not willing to negotiate with us. A deal we already negotiated, and then a deal we backed out of. So it's all very suspect, right? Now, when you really look at all of this and why now, and this is a question I know many of us have been asking over and over and over again, but, Netanyahu recently won his election, and Trump has befriended Netanyahu and the Israeli government to the point where they've even named a little section of Golan Heights now Trump Heights. And now they've unveiled their peace plan, the Israeli-Palestinian peace plan that is heavily in favor of Israel and really doesn't have anything for the Palestinians. So, and Iran is a Muslim nation, and you've got Trump, who's had a lot of rhetoric against Muslim nations and travel bans against Iran. And, there's a lot of this stuff going on. And clearly Netanyahu and Israel have been calling for the destruction of Iran for a long time. They want that nation destabilized. They want a new government in Iran. They don't like the existing government. They used to be friends with the old Iranian government. They're not friends with the current one. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But ultimately, I think what it comes down to, why we're ramping this up now, is because Netanyahu won his re-election. He's got a buddy in the White House. And now we know that Israel could potentially go and start the war with Iran, and we will be there as their allies to back them up. Now, the Senate is going to hold a vote on whether or not to demand Trump must ask Congress for approval before marching us into another war. And of course, Mitch McConnell thinks that it's totally unnecessary, even though the bill was both supported by Democrats and Republicans. There's plenty on both sides who say, this is in the Constitution, Congress is supposed to be declaring war. And yet we've had the president really get us into conflict after conflict after conflict and endless wars for a couple of decades now. And that needs to end. But likely this vote isn't going to do anything. Likely things are going to remain the same. Likely Trump is still going to be able to escalate this conflict and do whatever it is he wants. Now, and I'm not so sure if Trump himself really wants war. He is, to me, a little hard to read. But I do think plenty of people around him absolutely want the conflict. And they might talk him into it. And as we're getting closer to an election, and if he starts to see his numbers slipping, and if he really feels threatened that a Democratic nominee might actually beat him, then I think that we really might see definitely an escalation into war. Because as we know, it's the rally round the flag effect, which I talked about in a previous video. So now, also, just one thing I want to mention before I wrap this up, in regards to Congress and declaring war, what they really need to be doing. Now, when the founding fathers created this and when they said, look, Congress is the one who's to declare war, they also said that Congress was to raise the armies and raise the navies and fund those. So clearly the founding fathers were not expecting for us to have a standing army at all times with 1,000 bases around the world and a Congress constantly funding this war machine year after year after year, raising it up, raising it up, raising it up. And if Congress really wants to get the war powers back at this point, it's going to be very difficult because ultimately their job is to fund the military and to raise the military. Well, the military's been raised and the military's been funded. And now the president, who is the commander in chief, then it's his discretion to do what he wants with the military that Congress raised and funded. So this is going to be a tough battle to get those powers back in Congress. The only real way that I can see for them to be able to do that is to start hindering the amount of money that we're sending over to the military, to stop upping the ante, to stop upping the funds. But they're not going to do that because of the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex needs to justify itself. So here we are in more conflicts. So that's where we're at with Iran. That is the latest. And again, these current sanctions are not designed as people say they're designed. They're meant to be, oh, this is to pressure you so that you come to the table and want to negotiate. And that is just not what these are for. Clearly, these new sanctions, which appear to be worthless, and we can't even get details on them, are not really designed for that. It's just another step so that we can say we tried before going into conflict with Iran. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this channel, please support the show by subscribing and hitting the bell. Also, if you would like, I do have a Patreon and a PayPal down below. I do get demonetized a lot whenever I talk about war and terror. Apparently, they don't like truth telling when it comes to those things. So I do appreciate your support. Thank you so much for watching.